You're listening to CRM Audio, the Microsoft Business Applications and Power Platform podcast. I'm Joel Lindstrom here with George Dubinsky, and today we're talking about flow people versus app people. Good morning, George. Good evening, George.
Good evening. Good evening, Joel. How are you?
Good. So I wrote a tip of the day, which hopefully will be published around the same time we publish this podcast. I've noticed throughout the community, my colleagues, but especially the last month as I've been more active on the Power users forums, that there's a real divide. And you might think I'm talking about the divide between model-driven versus Canvas apps. No, I'm talking about the divide between flow people and app people. Have you noticed that, George?
I do notice that people prefer one or another, or particularly when teaching courses, you definitely notice that some students tend to go for Power Automate and find themselves comfortable, ask a lot of questions, and the next day people dealing with Canvas kind of kick in, and they're typically different people, sometimes overlap, like smaller classes. Jack of all trades, a person comes to class and they're trying to cover everything, but most of the time it's kind of people pick their favorite. Right. You think there's more to it than just personal preference?
I think, yeah, I have had almost on the same day the same conversation from different perspectives with different people, where the flow person says, oh, flow is so easy, but Canvas apps, you need to be a developer to really do that. Then the same day, somebody else who is a Canvas app aficionado says, oh, Canvas apps are so logical and easy to use, but if you really want to do anything with Power Automate, you need to be a developer. So it made me think that, there's maybe some other differences. I dug into it, and I actually reached out to some of our MVP friends and got some different perspectives. But if you think about it, I could think of, a handful of people who are known equally well for Power Apps and Power Automate. Daniel Christian, for one, is one of the MVPs who can be just as comfortable in both worlds. But then I think of a lot of other people, and you think of them like Eliza Benitez, flow person, Jerry Weinstock, flow person. And then you've got some people who are like my colleague Hardik Bhatia, awesome Canvas app person, but flow is a little bit foreign to him. So I think there's a mix, and so I got some reasons here that were cited by different people, and some I added myself. And I just kind of let's go through them, and I want to get what your take is. One of the ones I think is a big thing is, what did you learn first? Because there are key differences, and some of the expressions to do the exact same thing are like totally different between Power Automate and Power Apps. And so it's kind of like, what did you learn first? What was that first Nick Dolman said the wand chooses the wizard. I think he was just wanting to use Harry Potter illusions or something, but I think it's kind of true there that you have a problem you need to solve. You find that tool, it solves it. You have fond feelings because you now have your problem solved, and now you go all in on that one. And then just the differences, I think we kind of get scared by things we don't know. What do you think about that?
I think more importantly, where you come from. People don't come from from out of nowhere. There's a background. So people who learning these concepts, yes, there are a certain category of people who come from, I don't know, accounting, or even you may argue that Excel would be their kind of favorite tool. And from there, it would be logical to go to Power Apps. But I think it does depend on the background. Not only that, I was thinking about your post and was contemplating why I personally find myself some comfort in doing flows as opposed to creating Canvas. And I figured out it's because I don't have to deal with the user interface. Meaning, most of the time, I don't have to deal with users. And that's a huge plus.
Yeah. I think especially for those of us that coming from the Dynamics world where the UX was more or less done for us, that can be a stretch.
Exactly.
Although there are people, and I count myself in this, I've lately been leaning more towards Canvas apps than Power Automate. I mean, I've done Power Automate a bunch, and I kind of count myself in the middle. But I think what you're talking to, I see that as a visual versus logical thing. Just like setting aside the platforms. On our team, we've got really good developers, and some of them are really good UI developers, and then we've got others that are really good integration developers. And the integration developers don't have the patience for the user experience, but they can think through the complex logic on how things need to move and how systems need to connect with logic apps or a data factory or something like that. And so, I think it's different people are driven differently, and some are more visual, some are more logical.
Yeah, I think it's like comparing never-ending werewolves versus vampires, right?
Yes, and I think too another reason that several people cited were kind of inconsistencies in the formulas, which is you do one thing like simple math functions. There's significant difference. And I think, because...
I was just about to bring that up. Interesting. Go on.
Because, you can get very comfortable with how to do more complex, calculations in one platform, and it has nothing in common with the way that you would do that kind of expression in the other platform.
Yes, and that's where kind of clumsy operations and or actions in Flow, like add a number, that's where they come from. You're saying, add a number. I just want to write like A plus B. And probably by now you know that you cannot write A plus B in Flow and expect the results, right?
Yep.
You can put A plus B in Canvas, and that will be exactly A plus B, what you'd expect. Power Automate, on the other hand, it's got background in kind of expression language, which is different from the language that is used in Canvas. The language that is used in Flow you need to be able to kind of express it in the scripting format, so describe it in JSON format, so describe expressions, which is not too foreign for people who come from, let's say, programming background or studied some other languages. If you ever seen languages like Lisp, for example, which is when we used to write in Lisp, it's like we didn't have any assistant editor, so you had to count those brackets by hand, and Lisp was a nightmare because all I remember, you were counting brackets, but the logic of the language, the structure of the language, how it deals with expressions was kind of very similar how Power Automate uses the language. So you kind of, it's
the way it uses arrays and stuff is similar too, right?
Whatever. You describe the operand first, and then operation first, and then you describe what the parameters are. So which goes against the grain for people who try to express it in human terms, like A plus B. So you get left side of sort of one operand, and then operation, and then another one, and so, it does kind of depend where you're coming from. But interesting thing that you mentioned, it's like the names you mentioned, none of those names, like for example, in Power Automate, they're not developers, right? So they explore in Power Automate from the kind of high level point of view. Let's just use it. So for them, it's kind of logical. It's like Lego blocks. But people like John Liu, for example, they dive deep into it and write expressions and know how it's built inside. They know what's under the hood.
Right.
So those people would tend to be developers, and they would find more comfort in sort of pulling the Flow built-in Power.
Well, that's no different than the advanced patching functions you see inside of Power Apps. There's some, and this is one thing that Hardit mentioned as well, that specifically Java programmers, and I'm not a Java programmer, he was, but also some of the other people in the community. I believe Warren Bells, who is one of the leading people in the Power Users Forum, he's an old Java developer. So I'm taking the word of people who are Java developers that there's some similarities between expressions inside of Power Apps and Java that makes them gravitate more towards Power Apps and Power Automate. I
find it a bit odd, but
but here's the other thing, though. You mentioned something about the people who aren't developers. Here's another thing I think that is a little bit less intimidating about Flow than Power Apps to somebody who's not a developer is you can function very well within a lot of flows without touching expressions at all. I mean, you can use the field selector if you want to have something that updates a record, creates a record, even some fairly complex things like, list records and apply to each, do something in SharePoint. You can do a lot of things without writing expressions. When you do get to the expressions, this is something that the Power Apps people cite. Power Apps has done a lot to standardize.
Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. What the hell's with the 3-hour-long video? You're probably wondering.
I don't know
I realized I had this course sitting around that nobody was using. I wasn't selling it anymore. Didn't even make it for free.
Sorry, there was a YouTube video just started playing. Anyway, let me get back to my way. What I've heard multiple Power Apps people say is, okay, Power Apps has done a lot of work to standardize expressions. So CDS, you very rarely, if ever, need to use the schema name. Flow is a lot more inconsistent because you will regularly have to alternate between the display name and the schema name. So, for example, generally working with mapping fields, you use the friendly name, but then if you get into like filter queries and things like that, you have to switch to the schema name. And so, it's been brought up that within Power Automate, there's even within itself, there's some inconsistencies there.
What I find, what you described, interestingly, what I find is that, let's say a beginner, a person who comes from accounting background, whatever, the person who wants to be an app maker, I think they can achieve more with Power Automate. They go farther with Power Automate than they can achieve with Canvas. In Canvas, if you don't understand how expressions work, if you don't understand what you're trying to express, you're not going to get too far beyond the 3 screens produced for you by Wizard. And yes, you can modify those screens, but you get stuck very, very quickly. So you need to understand dependencies, you need to understand kind of logic of the app, how properties depend on each other, and so on. In Power Automate, you write in the process, and if you're not diving deep into fetch XML expressions and things like that, then you can comfortably get very, very far. Like what happened when you drop the file into a folder and you want to parse this file and break it apart and record some data into Dataflex Pro. See, I even remember it, and I had to say instead of CDS. But then, when you come to the point where you do need to kind of dig into expressions or use fetch XML, you quickly find yourself against the wall. It's sort of flow more like a, very, very easy road. But then you come to the wall you need to climb.
Then you start questioning all your life choices.
Yes, and Canvas, on the other hand, it's a steep climb from the get-go, but it's continuous steep climb. So you need to have some skills you need to be fit before you start the journey. Flow gives you a kind of a false illusion that you can get very, very, very far, and 2 miles in, you discover that, oh, damn, there's a wall to climb or, desert to cross and you're out of water.
Right.
Then you start honing your skills and kind of go and read and ask people and so on. So from that perspective, yes, definitely, Flow does allow you to go further, but you will find that the wall is much higher that you will need to climb eventually.
Yeah, I put it as quick wins in the post, which means most flows are shorter than. To build a flow is usually shorter than an app, and so you get some really quick wins, and you feel really good, and you're amazed at what it's doing. But people like Hearted and others have said the reward from Canvas apps, you can still get that payoff on every screen. But I agree but I think that ties into where did you come from and what did you learn first? It seems to me that if you go really deep into one or the other, it's harder in some ways to switch over. Where if you kind of learn them both at the same time or use them together, that's where again I think you could. But yeah, it's interesting, and I think a lot of this has to do kind of where you came from. Are you a Dynamics person or are you a SharePoint person? Because the SharePoint people, they got thrown into this before Dynamics people did because SharePoint Workflow got replaced with Flow. SharePoint Designer got replaced with Power Apps, and so that's what forced them to learn it. So if you were to take things you like in one of the platforms and put them into the other, or vice versa, what would you do? And I'll start off. I would take list records and apply to each from Power Automate and put it in Power Apps, because one thing I find a little bit on the frustrating side is how you have to type everything with Power Apps, especially for patching. If you have things that are more advanced than what you can do with a submit form, I wish I could have, the ability to visually map fields and, instead of typing for all and then patch and you get one semicolon out of place, it doesn't work. Give me the ability to trigger, without triggering an external flow, to just say, call a step, map the fields, and apply to each. That would be awesome. While keeping the ability of having the UX designer. I think that to me combines. And that's where I like them both. And there's other parts of Power Apps that I would, I would have a real collection inside of similar to what you can do with a collection inside of Power Apps. Yeah, you can list records, you could build an array, but it's kludgier than just a collect statement.
Yeah, there's one part, as I said, I personally lean towards Power Automate as my tool of choice. Maybe it's because I'm working on the latest projects primarily in Power Automate, migrating workflows and things like that. One of the things I would love to see is ability to define your own functions inside Power Automate. It's sort of procedures, right? So you can isolate a piece of functionality within Power Automate and declare it as something that you can call. So instead of repeating and copy pasting it, you can kind of procedurally call it. Yes, we do have kind of child flows, which helps a little bit, but they're a bit clumsy. Kind of the editing process a bit clumsy. I have to jump in. I have to start editing one and then come back to another, and then it wouldn't save because there is a parameter mismatch, and it's a whole thing.
My heart drops a little bit every time I design something that requires one thing to hand something off to the other thing, because it's one more point of failure. Just like I don't really like calling flows from Canvas apps. It works, but I much prefer.
No, it doesn't.
If we're using an app, I prefer to just have the app update the stuff rather than having it call flow, because if that flow doesn't get shared with the right people or something, it's another connector. So I think that would be great too.
Interestingly, what the other question is, of course, we are sitting here on our high model-driven horse and observing this, battle down below, and I just can't stop myself from wondering, what would you borrow in Flow or in Canvas from the model-driven?
Oh, I'll give you one right off the bat.
No. But that would be a subject for a separate discussion, wouldn't it?
Well, you asked. I have one on the very top of my mind. Finish the job with system views and let us not only have the gallery be filtered by a system view, but have us display the fields from the system view in the gallery, because that would solve so many issues with showing fields from related entities. There, that's mine.
You just lost me halfway through that.
So right now you have a Canvas app. You can
No, you don't have to explain to me. But I'm saying that yes, it's a suggestion. It still doesn't answer what is the kind of the formula that would define that a person would like Power Automate versus
let's do a follow up. Maybe what a follow up, and I'll write another tip of the day about what can each side learn from the other, because I think there's a lot of things that, again, these are not separate platforms, and I think if you are having a problem, you don't limit yourself just to the tool that you have at hand. Look at the other options and use the best tool for the job.
But interestingly, they do have one thing in common. That's a separate discussion altogether, that connectors allow you to consume data and functionality from elsewhere in either one. And that's kind of this where the power is actually coming from. So to me, there is a point where both Canvas and Flow, they both reach the point where you need to step back and say, hey, look, this functionality is too complex. You need to move it out, hand it over.
Well, and it's no different than the real-time versus background workflow process that we used to talk about a lot more. Because again, not every process should be a background process. Not every process should be a real-time process. And if you really want to get good at writing apps and processes that will scale, you need to understand the difference and when to use which. So learning both will make you a lot more powerful.
Okay. And I'm not sure why loop processing is bothering you. In Canvas, don't you use for all?
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that's was one example where I find that to be, I can do it a lot faster with Flow instead of manually typing all the fields that I want to patch.
You know what I found? That the fact that English is not my mother tongue complicates my life tremendously, because when I see a loop which says do until, it takes an extra mental power to calculate, to figure out what should go into condition.
Okay.
Right? I always create a positive condition first and then reverse it, because I can't figure it out otherwise.
That's just your normal optimistic sunny disposition, George. You always think of the positive, right?
No, do until is such an unnatural construct to me. It just doesn't sound right. While is okay because it's positive, right? Whilst something is true, do this. But do until is just the opposite, and it's kind of
it's like the workflow condition timeout, right?
Oh, that's my favorite. Okay.
Thanks for joining us.